Welcome to today's webinar, Smart Growth at 25, Looking Forward, Looking Back, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the National Center for Smart Growth and the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. This is also the first in a webinar series entitled Smart Growth at 25 with the National Center for Smart Growth, where we will address the history, principles, and implementation of smart growth, discuss what we have learned, identify issues not addressed by the original principles, and talk about where smart growth is going from here. We are recording this webinar and we'll be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Smart Growth at 25, Looking Forward, Looking Back. You can also search for event number 921-8514. So our speakers today are Garrett Knopp, Arnab Chakraborty, John Landis, and Rebecca Lewis. Garrett Knopp is a professor of urban studies and planning and the executive director of the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education at the University of Maryland. Garrett's research interests include the interactions between housing markets and policy, the economics and politics of land use planning, the efficacy of economic development instruments, and the impacts of environmental policy. He has authored or co-authored more than 65 articles in peer-refereed journals and co-authored or co-edited 9 books. Gerrit earned his BS from Wilmette University, his MA and PhD from the University of Oregon, and received postdoctoral training at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, all in economics. Arnab Chakraborty is a professor of urban and regional planning and associate dean of the College of Fine Arts and Applied Arts at the University of Illinois. His research concerns critical questions of housing and infrastructure development and the role of technology in advancing urban analysis and planning. In addition to his academic appointments, he is an editorial board member of the Journal of the American Planning Association and an associate editor of the Journal of Urban Planning and Development. Arnab's ongoing projects include mapping urban vulnerability to climate change and using scenario analysis techniques to advance long-range planning. He received a master's degree in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois in Chicago and a bachelor's in architecture from the Indian Institute of Technology. John Landis is a professor emeritus of city and regional planning at the Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania, where he taught progressive real estate development, urban and infrastructure finance, and planning theory. He previously held faculty positions at the University of California, Berkeley, the Georgia Institute of Technology, and the University of Rhode Island. John's work has focused on the efficacy of growth management, and he's finishing 2 books looking at global cities. The first is a series of 25 case studies on how urban entrepreneurs have transformed cities around the world in the realms of housing, transportation, redevelopment, public management, and environmental quality. The second, entitled Mega Projects for Mega Regions, is a global study of the successes and failures of transportation and urban development mega projects. Finally, Rebecca Lewis is an associate professor in planning, public policy, and management at the University of Oregon and the co-director of the Institute of Policy Research and Engagement. She studies land use policy, transportation finance, and the nexus of land use, transportation, housing, and climate change. Her research has been published in several peer-reviewed journals and has been funded by the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, the National Science Foundation, the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, and the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy. Following their presentation, the panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And with that, before we get started, we're going to take a quick poll like we always do, just asking everybody where you are coming from today. And you have 5 options on the screen.
What does it say?
We'll just give you a couple more seconds to respond here, and then we're going to turn it over to Garrett. And thanks to everybody for joining us today for the first of 4 sessions on kind of where we are with smart growth in 25 years. Okay, so we can see here that 44% of the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, where we are today, 21% in the South, 16% in the West, 15% in the Midwest, and 5% of our audience today is international. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Garrett Knopp. Welcome, Garrett.
Thanks, Michael. I hope folks can hear me. I presume somebody will tell me if you can't. So it's an honor to be here. I'm Garrett Knopp. I do direct the Center for Smart Growth at the University of Maryland, as I have for 20 years. I want to thank you all for joining us in the morning or the afternoon, wherever you may be. Certainly want to thank the Smart Growth Network for providing us with this opportunity, and of course our good friends at the Maryland Department of Planning just up the road for us. So I'm going to give you just a brief introduction to the topic of smart growth at 2025, which is the title of a book that's forthcoming that my colleagues on the panel are contributing to. And we welcome the opportunity to get some preliminary feedback on the work that we are doing on this book, and hope that we might get some additional insights through this conversation. So I want to begin with a brief discussion of why should we do or have a conversation of smart growth at 25. And the first is, as I think everybody on this network knows, the challenges remain formidable. We continue to drive single occupant vehicles to work. We continue to lose farmland. We continue to pollute the environment, and we spend more and more time on the road and less time in quality urban environment. So the challenges remain formidable. I'll provide some more information about that shortly. Smart growth is about 25 years old. You can debate exactly the birth of smart growth. I'll show you some milestones in a few moments. But the more important point really is that, you know, it's been around long enough to have an impact. We've been working at this for quite some time, whether it's 25 years or 30 years or what have you. And it's time to take a look at, you know, have we made any impacts? Are we making progress? On that question, there is now a significant body of research to review. Academics have done a tremendous amount of research. You know, over thousands of peer-reviewed journal articles have been published on the subject. And so it's a good time to begin to look at what is this body of work that we have compiled to address this question of, is it working? There is evidence to suggest that the brand is getting tired. It's been around for 25 years. We know that we've gone through stages of growth management and growth controls and smart growth and sustainable development. So smart growth has been around for a while, and I'll provide some evidence later on to suggest that it's not being used nearly as much as it has been in the past. And finally, this is a good time for policy change. With the start of a new administration, clearly this new administration will want to address these issues. We know they have concerns about this. And so thinking about where we've been and where we're going, we think is timely as this new administration gets going. The next slide, please. So a few comments about smart growth milestones. Again, the precise birth date of smart growth is hard to identify. But some critical milestones in the next slide include the development of the Awani principles in 1991 at a conference in California. The Smart Growth Network was established in 1995 or 1993. I've seen it actually identified in both years. If somebody on this webinar has specific information about whether it was 93 or 95, we'd appreciate hearing that. We also know that Smart Growth legislative guidebook published by APA and Stuart Meck's wonderful work was published in 1997. Maryland Smart Growth and Neighborhood Conservation Act was also passed in 1997. And the Natural Resources Defense Council's Toolkit for Smart Growth was also published in 1997. So if you think about 1991 as the birth date, Smart Growth is about 30 years old. If you think about 1997 as the birth date, Smart Growth will be about 25 years old next year. So we think, whether you want to talk about 25 or 20 or 30, it's a good time to be taking a look at these issues. Next slide, please. So the next slide will list the smart growth. Here we go. Here, there's the smart growth principles, and I'm certainly not going to review these for you. There will be some folks who will talk about this later on. These have become extremely well known. Ostensibly, they talk about where growth should take place. We prefer growth to occur in existing urban areas and protect the farm and forest land and to infill as much and refill as much as possible. We'd like that urban development to be mixed use. We'd like it to be relatively compact. We'd like it to be walkable and distinctive. We'd like to integrate our land use and transportation policies so that they are well coordinated. And we'd like to make sure that our planning and development processes are fair and cost effective and have extensive community engagement. So not going to say a whole lot about these principles. I'm presuming that everybody on this network is pretty well familiar with them. But these are the principles that define smart growth. So we think it's time to ask some big questions. First of all, does it work? Is there evidence that the smart growth principles are valid? Do we achieve the ends that we want to achieve if we follow the principles of smart growth? That's one important question. A second important question is, are we doing it? Are our land use policies, our plans, our regulations, our infrastructure investments, are they following the principles of smart growth? Or have we been making a lot of noise about smart growth and nobody is really doing it? A third important question is, are we making progress? I talked about some formidable challenges that are occurring on the transportation, on the land use and environmental front. Do we see any evidence that smart growth is making a dent in bending the curve on many of these important pressing issues? A fourth question is, well, did we miss something? Are there issues that have arisen over the last 10, 20, 30 years that we didn't address when we first thought about the principles of smart growth and that we need to address them now? And of course, finally, where do we go from here? Given that we have taken some time to think about these previous questions, what are the next challenges and how do we move forward? So in the next few slides, I just want to present a little bit of data from some of the work in the book that talks about selective national trends. Need to confess, of course, and make clear that you can't tell an awful lot from national trends because there will be regional variation and there will be some places where we're making a lot of progress and some places where we're not. We don't know what influence smart growth has had and what would have happened without smart growth. But I just want to tease you with a little bit of this national trend data to suggest that the challenges that we face, again, still remain formidable. So the first graph on the left shows urbanized area population densities, if you will, right? And we can see that population densities have fallen rather dramatically, particularly in the early post-war period, but seems to be leveling off. You can take some solace perhaps in the notion that densities are leveling off, but we can't see any evidence yet that densities are starting to rise. If we look at the graph on the right-hand side, we look at all land in farms from 1959 to 2019, we can see that we are continuing to lose land in farms, again, for a variety of reasons, but it's clear that farmlands continue to be consumed through the urban development process. On the next graph, which talks about housing Again, these are just a few quick graphs of a lot more graphs that are going to be coming out in the book. We can see that housing cost burden has remained relatively high. The number of people, the percent of people who are paying more than 30% of their income on housing on both the owner-occupied and the rental side continues to rise, or at least not fall the way we'd like to see it happen. If we look at the share of housing starts in the graph on the right, we can see that the single-family house continues to be about 70% of the housing construction, multifamily only around 30%. And while we've seen variation over the years in that percentage, the dramatic change that we had hoped in seeing, more of a mix of housing starts, there doesn't seem to be much evidence to support that just yet. The next graph, set of graphs talk about transportation issues. And the one on the left is vehicle miles traveled between 1960 and 2019. Of course, the pandemic has had tremendous impacts on this in very recent years, and we don't have those most recent data. However, we can see that there's been a standing upward trend in vehicle miles traveled per person. There was a decline during the recessionary period, but again, most of the evidence that we're looking at now seems to suggest that again, vehicle miles traveled per person is increasing. And if we look at the graph on the right, we can see that the mode share to work continues to be dominated by driving alone, which was the blue bar on the graph, and that a clear majority of people continue to drive alone to work, contributing to our congestion problems. The challenges that we confront continue to remain formidable. If we look at the term smart growth and its use in the media, we've had some data science folks take a look at how often smart growth, the word smart growth, the term smart growth was mentioned in some newspapers around the country. You can see that the line in red is the Washington Post, where the number of articles on smart growth was at its peak roughly in 2002, has declined rather precipitously since. The New York Times, the blue line, seems to have peaked in roughly 2005, 2006, and again has begun to decline. The Oregonian has never used the term smart growth as much as other parts of the country. In the green line, we can see a couple of peaks in roughly 2002 and 2012, and even the Baltimore Sun, where smart growth is talked about the most, seeing a pretty obvious decline. This graph illustrates three things actually. The first is the number of, or a count of the number of times smart growth was searched using the Google search platform. That's the blue line with the scale on the right. And we can see that when the data first became available here is roughly 2005, the number of Google searches, number of Google searches for the term smart growth has fallen ever since. The yellow line has information about the number of times that smart growth appears in the program for the National Planning Conference by the American Planning Association. And we can see that that peaked roughly in 2004 and has been declining relatively steadily ever since. And the red line shows the number of times that people have gone to the American Planning Association and their planning advisory service for information about smart growth, and very specifically the term smart growth. And again, we can see that that peak was roughly in 2001. So good news and bad news, but we think there's pretty strong evidence to suggest that for those of us who are supportive and been looking at smart growth for a long time, that now is a good time to revisit, to renew, perhaps rebrand, and recommit to the issues and the challenges that we committed to ourselves 25, 30 years ago. So we will be presenting information about this over the next 4 webinars, and I'm happy now to turn it over to my colleague, Arnab Chakraborty, who will present more information about these webinars as we go forward. Thanks very much. Arnab, are you there?
Yes, just got unmuted. Thank you, Gerrit, and thank you, Michael, for that generous introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Arnab Chakraborty, and I am a professor of urban planning at the University of Illinois. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I would like to share with you all a little bit more information about our forthcoming handbook of smart growth and about this 4-part webinar series that we are commencing today. Next slide, please. As many of you know, there is a lot of reading and reference materials already on smart growth. There are case studies and best practices compiled and published over the years by Smart Growth America, the EPA, the Lincoln Institute, and others. And I suspect that many of you in the audience have authored or contributed to some of these resources. There are also community or state-specific plans and policy documents that focus on smart growth, more on the implementation and process side. And finally, there have been more than a few studies, including some led by my fellow panelists here, that have attempted to measure the impact of smart growth. But collectively, however, we feel that most of these studies are over 10 years old at this point, and in our view at least, can't offer a summative and forward-looking perspective, something that our handbook and the webinar series will attempt to do. Next slide, please. A couple of years back, we, that is Gerrit, Rebecca, and I were invited to author an annotated bibliography on smart growth. Our look at the field confirmed a number of things, and Gerrit's mentioned a few of these already, but I'll summarize them again. First, we found that smart growth policies have had limited and uneven impact. I would say mostly restricted to communities located in large metros in coastal states. Second, as shown in multiple graphs by the previous speaker, public interest in this topic has declined significantly. Although I'm heartened to see almost 700 of you all here, but this refers to the general public. And lastly, the idea of smart growth, which might have been revolutionary 25 years ago, doesn't appear to resonate very strongly anymore. While we could say that the principles are enduring, and I certainly believe that they're useful as a list of good planning practice, I can tell you from my experience trying to teach this stuff that folks are hungry for stronger connections to social and environmental causes than smart growth principles could offer, as well as greater understanding of the intersections between smart growth and economic development, health, climate change, technology, and to name a few things. Rebecca, if you go back to the previous slide just for a moment, please. Thank you. So if you want a copy of our bibliography, which presents a good summary of this field, you can take a screenshot of the QR code there, and it will take you to that link. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these insights have been part of our guiding philosophy behind the forthcoming handbook on smart growth, which is expected, I believe, to be published early next year by the Edward Elgar Press. This was expected earlier, but of course, due to the pandemic, it has been a bit behind schedule. Next slide, please. So in this effort of writing the book, we wanted to look back, more like editing the book, we wanted to look back at the history of smart growth movement and what success it has had in achieving the goals underlying each of the 10 principles. We commissioned chapters by leading academics to understand how each principle of smart growth has been interpreted and pursued, and what impact, if any, these efforts have had, and also what lessons this offers for the future. But this part of evaluating and understanding the 10 principles is only about half of the handbook. The other half, parts 3 and 4, really look at not just the future of the original 10 principles, but on the relationship between smart growth and other prominent issues that were not reflected in the original 10 principles, but we feel which ought to be of interest to scholars, advocates, and planners. These we call the new horizons for smart growth, and they explore how smart growth could embrace questions of education, workforce development, public health, climate resilience, energy planning, social equity, and smart cities, to name a few. So in all, the book has 18 chapters by 36 authors, and we will be hearing from many of them over the course of this webinar series. So here's a sneak peek at the series. Next slide. Thank you. Today's session, you went too far, thanks. So today's session will focus on history and governance, and we'll hear from John Landis and Rebecca Lewis shortly about each of those topics. Webinar 2 will be at the same time on July 22nd. If you haven't signed up for it yet, I would suggest you add it to your calendar. And this one will focus on some of the original 10 principles, specifically issues of development location, urban form, and the transportation land use connection. The panel will include 3 authors of chapters from the handbook: Emily Tallon of the University of Chicago, Kelly Clifton of Portland State University, and David Newbern of the University of Maryland. The third webinar, which is scheduled for July 27th, will focus on topics that are not historically part of smart growth principles, but are worth paying attention to, especially now. Our speakers will be Willow Langamam of the University of Maryland, Nikhil Kaza of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Robert Goodspeed of the University of Michigan, and Jeff Vincent of the University of California at Berkeley. They will discuss their chapters from the handbook that concerns questions of equity and gentrification, energy transitions, smart cities, and workforce development, respectively. And finally, our 4th webinar's date and panel are still to be decided, but will be shared with you all soon. But the main focus of it will be on how smart growth, or at least the best ideas underlying smart growth, could endure and enhance their impact in the future. As Gerrit already noted, the panel will include thought leaders from the field. And yes, again, please continue to follow Smart Growth Online and MDP postings about further details. Next slide, please. So next, I'm just going to turn this over to my 2 esteemed colleagues here who are leading researchers and thinkers in this area. Our next speaker is Dr. John Landis, who is Crossways Professor in the School of Design at University of Pennsylvania, and his presentation will be titled Smart Growth at 25, Themes, Context, History, Results, Future. And after Dr. Landis, we'll hear from Rebecca Lewis. Dr. Lewis is an associate professor at the University of Oregon. Thank you all for your time and attention. If you have any questions about the seminar series, I don't know, Michael, if we can take it now or through the question format, or I'll just turn it over to John.
Yeah, they're submitting via the text tool.
Okay, thank you. John Landis.
Okay, great. So you can all hear me. It's a pleasure to be joining you today on one of my favorite topics. You know, I'm looking back at Garrett's slides, and he showed the list of queries on Google of smart growth, and I was surprised that there weren't more in 2019 and 2020 when many of us were working on our chapters. I think I contributed myself about 1,000 questions about smart growth to Google, but I guess in the scheme of things that doesn't add up to as much as I would have hoped. I'm here today to talk to you about where we are today in smart growth and how we got here, and to give you a few ideas about where we might be heading, hopefully, over the next 10 to 15 years with regard to smart growth. Have the next slide, please. So here's just another restatement of what the 10 core principles of smart growth are. And if you're like me, you look at this and say, well, this isn't anything new. This has been around for a long time. What's so different about this? What's so great about this? Everybody accepts these ideas. And I want to take you back about 25 years to when some of these ideas were pretty new. Others weren't, but some were. No less than Tony Downs said that, you know, there's really, in 1992, there's nothing really all that new about smart growth. It mostly relies on existing local growth management tools like urban growth boundaries and like adequate public facilities ordinances, and even to a large extent, things like zoning. Not much new here. I think that really missed the bigger picture. When we go back to the world of land use regulation and growth planning about 20 years ago, it really was focused on regulation. And what the smart growth movement, and I'm going to call it a movement again several times, introduced was the 3 new big ideas to the planning world. The first that it was that it was a collaborative effort between planners, developers, and designers. I don't want to say that all of these groups were at odds with each other previously before, but designers were always wondering why planners had to standardize everything with zoning ordinances. Planners were always wondered why designers didn't do a better job thinking about designing in coordination with plans, and developers were always wondering why both groups seemed to get in their way. What the smart growth movement did, first through the Congress of New Urbanism and then through the Smart Growth Network, was it brought all of these groups together, talk about incentives and choices. Again, previous efforts at land use regulation had mostly focused on regulations which narrow choices, and now smart growth was talking about giving people more transportation choices, giving people more housing choices and housing opportunities, making sure that neighborhoods are walkable as well as drivable. I think most importantly, previous efforts at land use regulation had been maybe anti-sprawl, but they weren't pro-infill. And what smart growth did said, let's focus on where maybe some of the growth that's restricted from the edge goes. Let's focus as well on incentivizing infill. That was pretty new about 25 years ago. And for the developers, smart growth said something that was really, really, really important. It said, in addition to pursuing these outcome-oriented results, like more choice and reducing sprawl and encouraging infill, for the developers, it said, we want to make the development decision process more predictable, fairer, and more cost-effective. All the developers who've sort of been stuck in endless reviews that reduced choice and reduced opportunities, by making the process fairer, more predictable, and more cost-effective, that's the way we can increase choices. So the blue things on this list were really pretty new and pretty important and pretty significant back in 1990, 1991, even if they're a little old hat today. So when I look at smart growth, I see it as sort of the third generation of land use management in America. And in each case, each generation that's come along has taken a bigger bite at the problems and tried to sort of deal with the things that the previous generation didn't. At least in my mind, the first generation lasted for a good 40 years, from 1926 to 1968, and was really focused on zoning, which is really, when you think about it, it's all about massing, and it's all about uses, and it's all about the allowable impact. But you want to make sure that each development project, each parcel, each land use minimizes its adverse impacts on its neighboring parcels, on the neighboring uses. And zoning is about minimizing adverse impacts, but it's on a parcel by parcel basis. And the problem was that when you totaled up all the zoning ordinances, you didn't have any sense of cumulative impact. What was the impact of development in total on the entire community and maybe on the entire region? And zoning couldn't get you there. It couldn't help you with that, with minimizing cumulative impacts. The first real attempt to do that was in 1968 in Vermont with its Act 250, which said we're going to look at cumulative impacts of development on a regional or multi-municipal basis. In 1969, Ramapo said we're not just going to look at cumulative impacts, but we're going to look at the rate, the relationship between the rate of development and cumulative impacts, and try and manage the rate of population growth and development as a way of mitigating cumulative impacts. Of course, the big 800-pound gorilla was environmental review. That came along in 1970 with the National Environmental Policy Act, and California, the California Environmental Quality Act. And that said, we're going to look at cumulative impacts, and we're going to ask developers to help mitigate them. At first, it was purely environmental impacts, but it's been broadened to include all sorts of other impacts. So the second phase, second generation, focused on cumulative impacts and mitigating impacts on a larger than parcel basis. Now, the problem here with both generations 1 and 2 is it's all about impacts. It's not about necessarily creating better places. All of you who are planners know that good places are more than just places that don't suffer from adverse impacts. They have a holistic quality about them. they create choices, they create opportunities, and none of the first two generation things did that. They were all about process and regulation. And again, those of you who are in practice know you can't create great places alone through regulation. And so starting in the late 1980s, people started talking about, well, how do we create better places? And we saw the emergence of the new urbanism, and I'll talk more about that, which focused on literally the creation of better places, primarily better suburbs. How do we make better suburbs better? Well, we want to create more choice in them. And importantly, that new urbanism didn't focus on regulation, it focused on design and opportunity creation. And then in 1994, we saw the emergence of smart growth. Now, you're going to hear from me that the new urbanism and smart growth are really two sides of the same coin, both focusing on outcomes and making better places. But whereas the new urbanism focused on placemaking, the smart growth is focused on improved outcomes and more particularly choices and balancing regulations with incentives. Now, let me talk a little bit more about this history, if I can get the next slide. I'm going to touch on a few of the really significant occurrences and events that happened in this history of smart growth. And I'm going to break it into three eras: the era of precursors, which goes from 1975 to 1993, the era of when smart growth really mainstreamed from about 1993 to about 2005, and then the current period we're in where smart growth has faced some challenges of relevance. So I really date the growth of the beginning of smart growth to 1979, when Portland adopted the nation's first metropolitan urban growth boundary. Now, I was just reviewing a journal article this morning that pointed out that Lexington, Kentucky actually had this first urban growth boundary in the country, but Portland's was the most extensive, and Portland was a much faster growing city, and so the urban or region, and so the urban growth boundary was going to have a much bigger effect. And we can talk more later about whether urban growth boundaries, how well they've worked, but the idea that you would try and control the outward extension of sprawl at the metropolitan level, and then more equally important, try and redirect that development into infill areas and passed over areas and other areas, redevelopment, refill, infill, really came out of the Portland's urban growth boundary in 1979. 1979 was also the year that Robert Davis hired DPZ to design Seaside, Florida, which was really a revelation. It was basically the first new urbanist community in the country. It was a little bit of a toy, but it demonstrated that some of the design principles were possible. And again, the most exciting thing about Seaside, Florida, to me as a planner, was that it embedded lots of choices in its design: housing choices, neighborhood choices, architectural choices, transportation choices. They were embedded in its design. So you see this idea of controlling sprawl, encouraging infill, and designing choice into communities coming in 1979. In 1986, Florida introduced the idea of concurrency, which is the infrastructure investments and growth ought to go together. Concurrency didn't really work as a in Florida, at least, as a policy, but the idea of matching infrastructure investments, particularly transportation, to land use and development has really gained a lot of importance. 1988 was the year 1,000 Friends of Oregon undertook the LUTRAC project, Land Use, Transportation, and Air Quality projects, which brought together, using a scenario-oriented view, the idea of, again, how do you coordinate urban development, transportation investments in air quality, and how do you do that in a coordinated way? And how do you do that using computers to think about the future and specific sites and how specific sites fit into the big picture? Garrett mentioned the Ahwahnee principles, which is 1991, based on a meeting at Yosemite Park's Ahwahnee Hotel. I don't know if it's still called that. It's gone through several names. And that was a meeting convened by California's local government commission to explore guidelines that planners and designers needed for better suburban and urban placemaking. And if you go back to look at the Awani principles, you can still find them. They're really wonderful guides to how to create better places for everyone. 1991 was also the year that Congress passed ICE-T, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, which said to metropolitan planning organizations, for the first time, don't just think about transportation investments, but think about how transportation investments link to land use and development. If linking transportation and land use is the essence of smart growth, well, there in 1991, we see Congress directing all MPOs, telling them, you're not just in the transportation business, you're in the planning business as well. And in 1993, the Congress for New Urbanism formed to provide advice and technical assistance and to really to push the ideas and exchange of best practice about how to create better placemaking. Now, while architects and designers were focusing on the Congress for New Urbanism, planners were trying to look at policies and programs that would create better infill and better places and more choices. In 1994, the American Planning Association began efforts to categorize and catalog those possible policies and practices. And that began the effort to prepare, as Garrett mentioned, Stuart Meck led an effort to prepare what became the Smart Growth Legislative Guidebook. It was first published in 1997, and that was a wonderful review of where we've been in land use regulation, what tools we have, and how those tools can be used to promote smart growth. It's huge, but it's really terrific. In 1996, energy is just building around this. The US EPA forms a smart growth network to bring together all the people who are interested in these principles in smart growth. Between 1996 and 2000, 17 states formed task forces and legislative commissions to study the adoption of potential smart growth legislation. That is legislation that would tell cities to include in their plans and zoning ordinances and other regulations like subdivision regulations, the principles of smart growth. Don't just do planning, but do planning this way. 17 states talked about doing that. Only one, really only one, wound up with state level smart growth legislation, and that was Maryland. And that legislation came forth in 1997 at the urging of Paris Glendening, enacting the Maryland Smart Growth Act. And the keystone of the Maryland Smart Growth Act is the priority funding area idea, which says the state is going to give additional investment money and additional service monies to those cities and counties and jurisdictions that restrict sprawl and promote infill development. So we're not just going to, at the state level, we're not just going to regulate sprawl, we're going to incentivize infill. In 2000, Smart Growth America is established. In 2000, also, the National Center for Smart Growth Education and Research is established at the University of Maryland. So for the first time, we're not just going to advocate this, but we're going to review it. We're going to evaluate it. We're going to see if it works. And that's some of what we're here today. In 2004, Sacramento Area Council of Governments published its first blueprint plan, which to my mind was the first time smart growth principles, about 15 of them in all, had been embedded in a regional comprehensive plan. Portland had done something earlier with its framework plan, but the SACOG's blueprint plan was the first time it was really put together in a clear regional way, all these smart growth principles. Now you'd think, wow, we're on a streak here. Smart growth is going to take over the world, but it didn't. And the reason it didn't was a bunch of reasons, but in 2007, New York City came out with its masterful plan, Plan YC. And I think in many instances, Plan YC is the best urban plan since perhaps the original plan for Chicago by Daniel Burnham. If you've never read Plan YC, it's just remarkable. Plan YC was organized not around smart growth, but around the idea of sustainability. A few years earlier, the IPCC had come out with their fourth assessment. Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth had come out recently. And New York said, we're going to have not really a regional plan, a citywide plan, but New York City is practically a region. They said, we're going to organize our entire planning process around the idea of sustainability. And the quality of that plan just really was really impressive. And I think it did more to convert sort of smart growth to sustainability than anything else. In 2009, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy published its first comprehensive evaluation of statewide smart growth initiatives. These were state-level smart growth initiatives, and basically the Lincoln Institute said, nice attempt, but not much. There's not much difference between the states that have done smart growth or statewide smart growth and the states that didn't. So potential promise here, but at least as of 2009, hadn't been realized. In 2009, under the Obama administration, the U.S. Department of Transportation and HUD and the EPA got together to form a joint group called the Partnership for Sustainable Communities to coordinate their grant and project funding around smart growth principles. So DOT was interested in transportation choice, HUD was interested in housing choice, and the EPA was interested in protecting the environment. Those three dovetailed tremendously through the Partnership for Sustainable Communities. There was just one problem with that partnership. It didn't have any new money. It just said, let's take the existing pots of money in each of the three agencies and spend them in a coordinated way, when what was really needed was some new money. Tea Party came along in 2010 and said, not going to be much new money for anything. The Partnership for Sustainable Communities soldiered along for about 8 years, doing some very good work, funding some very interesting projects around the country. But in 2017, the Trump administration finally sort of let it lapse. And I'm happy to say that your presence here today at this webinar hopefully will signal the rebirth of smart growth and the publication of the Smart Growth Handbook. So that's a little bit of history, how we got to where we are today, what it's about, and maybe where we're headed. And so I'm just going to ask the question of, did the smart growth movement succeed? Did it change? What changed? Did it change anything? And I think the answer depends on what your expectations were. If you thought that the result of smart growth should be a change in state and local planning practice, then I think you're going to be disappointed. Of the 17 states that drafted smart growth legislation for their local governments to implement, only one, Maryland, ever adopted a comprehensive smart growth package and pursued it. So in terms of legislation, which is really what the Smart Growth Handbook, Smart Growth Guidebook, APA's Smart Growth Guidebook was oriented toward, a little bit of a disappointment. If you say, instead of asking about legislation and policy, you ask, well, did things change on the ground? They changed a lot. And here's just my favorite statistic of the nation's 25 largest cities in 1960. So if we go back to 1960 and say, what were the nation's 25 largest cities? 19 of them lost population between 1960 and 1980. Over the next 20 years, 19 of those 25 cities lost nearly 4 million people as we saw the rise of white flight and suburban sprawl and the growth of the suburbs. If we come back to those same 19 cities that lost 4 million people between 1960 and 1980, if we go to the period between 2000 and 2020, those same 19 big losers gained 281,000 people among them as people came back to urban neighborhoods and came back to cities. Now, 281,000 may not sound like a lot compared to 4 million, but it's a turnaround. And more importantly, if you net out Chicago and Detroit, the situation would be even better. We'd be looking at about 1.5 million population growth in the nation's 25 largest cities between 2000 and 2020. That's old line cities. So clearly, if one of your criteria for smart growth is to take sprawl and convert it into infill, something seems to have worked, even if we can't attribute all of that to smart growth. I think, to me, a better indication of the success of smart growth is if you look at the plans of the nation's fastest growing counties and cities, and you take a deep dive into their plans and into their planning documents, and you say, what are the guidelines and guiding principles in those plans? And I did that as part of my chapter. I looked at the nation's 10 fastest growing counties and 10 fastest growing municipalities of more than 50,000 size. And the majority of those are in Florida and Texas. I don't know how many of you here are from Florida and Texas. And in 7 of the nation's fastest growing counties and 5 of its fastest growing cities between 2000 and 2018, smart growth principles were the centerpiece of their planning documents. Now you could ask, how well are they being implemented? Maybe not as well as we would have liked. But if you say, well, has this risen to the mainstream consciousness, even in places that we don't think about as necessarily pro-planning? When we look at the actual local governments, the answer is they seem to be on board with smart growth goals and smart growth values. And I have the final slide. So where do we go from here? I think we're gonna get the final, can I give the, yeah. I think we really have to broaden the idea of smart growth, and here are a few quick ideas for how to do that. When people started talking about containing sprawl and promoting infill, they really didn't think about the adverse impacts of that, including gentrification. So now we have to start adding tools to deal with the housing affordability impacts of gentrification. I'm not sure planners are that interested in stopping gentrification, but it has some adverse impacts, and we've got to confront those impacts head on. We've also got to use smart growth to create social and economic mobility opportunities, not just housing and transportation opportunities. Find out ways to use growth, smart growth, to energize more economic and social mobility opportunities for marginalized communities. We've got to get on the carbon emissions reduction bandwagon, or the climate bandwagon. And the way to do that is to start talking about urban forms and transportation systems that have a reduced carbon emissions intensity. And the sort of shorthand for that is electrify everything, more electric cars, more electricity and heating and things like that, because you can produce electricity using renewables in a way that you can't with other fuel sources. So coupling carbon emissions reductions to growth, very important. Improving the integrity and productivity of natural ecosystems. And smart growth said, well, if we don't develop natural areas, they'll be okay. And not sure that was true. We really have to think about how we improve the functioning of natural ecosystems. That includes farms and forests, but it also includes biodiversity. So we have to go a little further and start talking in terms of natural capital. This has been much in the news these days. We've got to reduce the dominance of single-family only zoning, proposing more housing choices if you still keep all your zoning as it were. Well, that doesn't really work out so well. So we've got to revisit single-family only zoning. And lastly, we have a whole new set of opportunities around infill available to us, with possibilities of reusing tired shopping centers and now empty office buildings. And if you want to know what the possibilities for doing that are, just look at downtown Los Angeles and what they've done with the Los Angeles Adaptive Reuse Ordinance, where in the period between 2000 and 2012, the city of Los Angeles, by allowing developers to go in and reuse old industrial and commercial buildings, to reuse them for housing, as of right, and to reuse them for housing without having to provide additional parking when there was nearby transit. So basically, you're using incentives and deregulation to promote infill. In the space of the 14 years that I mentioned, downtown Los Angeles gained 50,000 new housing units, whereas before it only had 5,000. So I think looking at things like the Los Angeles ARO experience is a good starting place for thinking about what might be possible with a new version of smart growth. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Don. I appreciate you touching on many of the topics that we'll be digging into later on in our webinar series as well. So as we continue through this webinar series, we'll talk about some of those 10 principles that Don mentioned, and we'll talk about what was missing from smart growth in the original 10 principles. And then we'll close with some of what John was talking about on the last slide. Today, I'm going to talk about the governance side of things. John mentioned the sort of lack of adoption by various states. So I'm going to take a step back and talk about land use governance in general, and dig into what different states did, how much any of that has stuck around over time, and how we've seen state level land use and growth management policy shift. I'll close with some thoughts on a new paradigm of where we might see things going later on as well. So I'm one of 3 co-authors on this chapter that focuses on governance. Much of my own research is focused on state level smart growth and growth management policy over time. So this is an area of significant interest to me. So I gave you this overview of where I'm going to go and how we've structured our book chapter. The image there on the right is Maryland's priority funding areas. This state level graphic is from 2011, which says some things about where we are with smart growth and sort of how it has continued over the last decade. To start, to take a step back, many of you on this call are likely planners and are aware of the politics around state level land use planning. So most of land use planning in the United States has been given over to the local government. This is in line with some of our sort of these older theories around marble cake versus layer cake of governance, and how things have kind of gotten all swirled up with how we address land use issues. With the federal government focusing on environmental issues, housing, transportation, allocating funding, the state government having some limited role in land use planning in some instances, but mostly ceding this authority to the local level, with some attempts to focus on issues at a regional level, to incentivize doing things at a regional level, and to think about how transportation and environmental issues should be addressed at a regional level as well. But as I mentioned, most things happening at a local level, zoning and planning and other sorts of things being given over to this, the smallest level of government. But we also know that there have been different attempts to do something different, particularly in the 1970s. So this historic report written by Bosselman and Callies in 1971, The Quiet Revolution in Land Use Control, whereby states started to take back some of the power that they had given over to local governments. John gave you a history of some of the different state level approaches to managing growth, from this attempt to control growth and limit growth using tools like urban growth boundaries, to thinking more about infrastructure in the second wave, to the third wave of trying to use incentives instead. And then something that Chapin advocated in 2012 in a JAPA special issue, this era of sustainable growth that focused more on regional and sustainable planning, and thinks a little bit more about visions and getting the private sector and public sectors to work together. So Chapin and Wheats in particular have advocated for these different eras and talked about the different policies to get there. Today, I'm going to focus on the smart growth era in particular and show you a map of the states that had adopted something related to smart growth, often initiatives from a government and from a governor, some sort of special initiative from a governor that existed only for a short period of time. The source of this map came from DeGrove's 2005 book, where DeGrove talked with lots of different people at a state level to understand how these policies were adopted. By 2021, only 2 states have the sort of remnants of these policies. Both Maryland and Connecticut adopted priority funding areas in some way, but most other states have really gotten rid of the policies that they put in place. There are some remnants out there, smart growth award programs, smart growth grant programs, but for the most part, the state level smart growth policy has faded away. Some examples of some of these policies look like. There's a longer table within the book, and I know that this is a lot of text. So Maryland, as John mentioned, had this broad suite of programs that focused on urban areas, rural areas, and revitalization areas. New Jersey tied smart growth in with their existing state plan process to provide some grants to help incentivize smart growth. Minnesota had a gubernatorial initiative that only existed for a really short period of time and then disappeared after the governor was no longer in office. Maine adopted lots of different policies, but eliminated their state planning office in 2012. So a lot of these things were really aggressive in the late 90s, early 2000s, but then faded away or disappeared over time. What we saw, and John mentioned as well, was a shift to more focus on climate change, more focus on sustainability, more focus on governance, and federal focus on regional partnerships. So the federal government started to work across silos at a federal level and to give grants at a regional level through the Partnership for Sustainable Communities. But as John mentioned, this was a really short-lived program, only 2 funding cycles for these grants. And that sort of faded away with this rise in what we call the unquiet devolution of state land use authority. So there was this quiet revolution towards more state land use control in the 1970s, but in 2010, with the Tea Party movement, anti-Agenda 21 efforts, there was a lot of rolling back of legislation. We saw this in Maryland with the sort of attacks on the state plan process. We saw this in Florida through the Community Planning Act in 2011, and other states as well, really aggressively dismantling some of these policies that had come into being before. And of course, this continues, as John mentioned, through the Trump administration, through rollbacks in environmental policy, through letting the Partnership for Sustainable Communities dissolve, as well as other specific policies as well. As Garrett mentioned, we're kind of on the precipice of new paradigms. So we've seen more focus on climate change at a state, regional, and local level. We've seen more focus on trying to think about regulations, particularly around housing and zoning. These are totally different approaches to different state level policies in the past that focused on containing growth, that focused on using incentives. This instead is a really more marbled approach to thinking about the state saying, local governments, you have to do zoning differently. And at the same time, we are seeing on the right-hand side, lots of pushback to that approach, not just from the right, but from the right and the left in terms of being against changes in single-family zoning. So Oregon was the first to do this on a state level for cities of a certain size, requiring the duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes are allowed in single-family zones. But we've seen Connecticut and other states move in this direction as well. So as we continue throughout this webinar series, we'll start to talk about some of these issues more, to start to look at how equity, affordability, and these social outcomes have also started to be important when we think about state level policy. So stick with us throughout the rest of the webinar series. And for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Michael, who will facilitate your questions and discussion.
Great, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to everybody for submitting questions and comments today. I think that may be part of the fact that this is the first part of a series and we'll be getting into more detail moving forward, that a lot of folks have submitted comments in addition to questions. So we'll share some of those as well and get some response. And I'm going to ask the presenters, other than Garrett, whose camera's not working today, if you can turn on your webcams so that we can see you during the Q&A section here. Thanks for turning those on. Thank you. Okay, I guess the first one is kind of a comment here that we just got a couple minutes ago from Priti Irani, who is saying regarding John Landis's presentation, was hoping to see more on authentic engagement of marginalized communities, just not only offering more transportation choices from marginalized communities. I hope to see more of sharing power with marginalized communities in New Horizons. I wonder if you want to comment on that, and for some of these, if you want to talk about what we'll be talking about in the future webinars as well, possibly.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. And as I suggested on my last slide, I think that's one of the 6 frontiers we really have to address. Maybe it might be the most important, which is it's one thing to talk about choice, which is what Smart Growth did, talked about transportation choice, land use choice, housing choice. But it's quite another to recognize that not everybody has access to those choices. And so the next phase of smart growth has to look at communities that have been historically marginalized, either for race or gender or economic reasons, and say, how do we provide two types of opportunities? Opportunities to be engaged in the political process and the decision-making process. And that's a job, I think, substantially for planners and the people on this seminar, but also how do we create better mobility pathways, both social mobility pathways and physical mobility pathways and economic mobility pathways. And there's some important work at the Opportunities Insights Project at Harvard about how to link policy, particularly housing policy, to greater mobility options. And I think for us not as planners not to address both broadening the engagement platform and to expand mobility options as we move ahead would be a huge mistake.
Great, thanks. And if others want to add to one of the responses, you can please do so. Next question here is also starts with a comment. I haven't heard much talk today about equity and how to make smart growth approaches more equitable by righting the wrongs in land use and built environment policies of the past. How do you see that being addressed in a wholesale way across the country?
Well, I'll jump in jumping in where angels fear to tread. I think a bunch of places have done some things that are worth copying. They're not always copied, but they are worth emulating. That do again create more opportunities for marginalized communities. Again, primarily focusing on housing. I'd say inclusionary housing, inclusionary zoning, where it's been tried seriously, has been a great success or can be a great success. That's one alternative. And the other thing, as Rebecca talked about, what Minneapolis is doing and what Portland are doing with regard to allowing, in Portland's case, up to 6 units in single-family zones, has the potential to really open up what have been primarily white, upper-class, and elite neighborhoods to much more diverse economic and social and demographic populations in a big way. And so the fact that that's happening in the United States, things often happen first at the local level. The fact that that's happening is very encouraging. I think as planners, we need to keep an eye on it, study it, and where it's working, celebrate it. And I think one of the big problems with America is we have a non-invented here syndrome at the local level. I think as planners, we ought to change that to stealing from the best. And in the case of providing more social and economic mobility, we ought to look at those places that are doing good work and try and borrow their concepts.
Could I chime in here quickly, Michael?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. It is the most pressing issue planners face today. And we have 2 chapters in the forthcoming book, one explicitly, generally on equity and trying to embed equity into the 10 principles, and one on gentrification. So I would say that, one of the challenges of revitalizing smart growth is to extend the principles beyond issues of physical form to issues of social equity. So, I mean, issues of social equity really don't appear in the 10 principles. And so in the forthcoming book, we have chapters on equity, on gentrification, on public health, on workforce development. Somehow we need to make sure that our social agenda gets embedded in the physical agenda. One of the critical challenges will be, if we're going to promote infill, we're going to reduce sprawl, we're going to encourage infill development and high density development. How do we make sure that doesn't displace people? Can we have a revitalization and redevelopment without gentrification? I think that's one of the most pressing questions for the smart growth community right now.
And I'll just tag on very briefly to say that I think that some of these state level approaches help us get out of some of the parochialism that has happened over time at the local level. By states turning over this authority for zoning to the local level and letting them do whatever they want, we end up with tons of single family zoning. By states now flipping the script and saying, you have to allow for other types of housing, you have to allow for other types of zoning, that's a policy way that we can start to address some of these issues as well. The outcomes are still to be determined. Whether this actually leads to more equitable outcomes is a huge question, but it at least allows for the creation of more housing in more places, and in more places that have access to opportunities.
Great, thanks everybody. Next question here is from Jeff Martin, who's saying, when will smart growth advocates start to better embrace and articulate free market solutions? This is all a great discussion today, but it's just talking to ourselves. How can normal Americans, non-bureaucrats, help to advance smart growth?
So I'll take a preliminary stab at that. So I do think that smart growth advocates should get credit, as John was saying, from trying to move away from a regulatory to a more incentive-based approach. That was very strong in the Maryland program and very much a part of the sort of fiscalization of land use policy that happened earlier. But it's not entirely clear that free market principles are going to get us where we need to go. So yes, we would like to see more choices. We would like to see markets work effectively. But we've also seen that one of the very significant limitations of smart growth is such reliance on incentives. Incentives mean you can choose to do it, or you cannot choose to do it. And in some cases, you don't want to allow that choice. So finding the right balance between regulations and free market principles is again one of the fundamental challenges. And we can have a very powerful debate about whether we need to move more in the incentive direction or whether we need to return more of a regulatory direction. I think that's.
Looks like Garrett cut out. Did anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just like to add to that. When I was studying the Los Angeles Adaptive Reuse Ordinance for one of the books I'm writing, I was really impressed by the process they took of planners and developers, and in some cases later on equity advocates coming together to say, how will this form of deregulation benefit all of us? Let's play out some scenarios about not just deregulation in principle, not just markets in principle, but how specific loosening of restrictions and how specific incentives will actually play out on the ground to benefit people. And I think we have to do that. We can't just talk about the ideology of deregulation. We actually have to play it out and see how it works.
Okay, thank you. Next question here is from Chris Nelson, who I think a lot of people here know. Very prominent academic and planner, who's asking, does your book get into leveraging demographic changes along with community preferences to advance smart growth?
Well, yes and no. Chris, nice to hear from you. Certainly in the chapters that focus more on the social issues, there is background information on demographics. We know that the country is becoming more diverse all over the place, that the needs and the housing preferences of those people change. So I think what you will see, particularly in the chapters on public health and on housing and on workforce development, that they will see some great sensitivity and building on the recognition that we're going to have a much more diverse and demographic changes in the offing.
Okay. Next question here is also kind of a comment from Amy Powell, who says, I'm a planner advocating for public health. 10 years ago, when I joined the health department, I borrowed the concept of smart growth to address health. Today, the new generation of planners understand the concept of social determinants of health. It's time to reframe smart growth as a means to address the social, economic, and environmental conditions of neighborhoods and places. Who wants to respond to that?
I'll respond with, well, yeah, we couldn't agree more. And again, there is a chapter that's written by some folks at the University of Utah reviewing Andrew Garfunkel that addresses that very issue.
Okay. Does anyone have any suggestions for minimizing NIMBYism in the development and planning process? I've seen it too often change what were initially good to great projects into mediocre to fair projects.
I have filed amounts of things to say here, but one brief comment would be by mandating things at a state level, requiring local governments to all adopt things, you can take some of the NIMBYism out of the process because these things are now required or mandated everywhere or allowed everywhere. The other thing I would say is that allowing development by right and allowing certain styles of development by right can take some of the sort of public sort of feedback into the development process off the table as well. So again, I think it's to be determined whether these things will play out well. In Oregon, even despite allowing for duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, some cities are taking a lot longer to adopt, still facing NIMBYism in the process of implementing the state rules. And so it hasn't disappeared completely. Even Portland faced lots of NIMBYism in adopting the residential infill project. So it doesn't go away, but it is a chance to level the playing field a little bit more across different communities. So you don't have one community that's willing to accept growth and one community that continues to shun growth from its boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think particularly in fast-growing communities and cities, we've got to have, let's call them by right zones, where developers, if they do what is allowed in the zoning and the planning regulations, are allowed to do it without having to go through an extensive review process. But I think it's very important that let's call them these as-right development zones, what you can do in them and where they are, those decisions are made by a participatory planning process. What the big mistake California made with its SB 50, which tried to create these as-of-right development zones around transit districts, around transit stations, was have them designated by politicians and planners, which is not a terrible idea, but it's not a great idea for the people who live in those communities. So if you couple as-of-right ideas with participatory planning process, I think you can make some progress on the NIMBY.
Thanks, John. Next question is from Lois Bush, is a two-part question. Will use of performance metrics be addressed in the new guidebook? And what about the importance of political will?
I'll jump in quickly before I'll turn it over to Arnab, who looks like he wants to say something. Emily Talon, in her chapter on sense of place, talks a lot about performance-based zoning and the potential that has for producing more livable places and places with a sense of place. So indeed, that is something that gets directly addressed substantially in Emily's chapter.
Okay, did you want to add anything, Arnab?
Gerrit, are you done or did you get cut off? I wasn't sure.
I'm done. I turned off my mic.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, no, Emily Talon was one. She will be presenting at the next session, which is on July 22nd. There was a second part to the question, Mike. Could you please repeat that, Michael?
It was a question about what about political will? What role does that play in all of this?
I think that's considered in a lot of chapters related to the specific issues that are being discussed. Yeah.
Okay. Next question here is from James Price, who's asking, how do we incentivize small-scale developers? Suburban sprawl and cookie-cutter development has been supercharged by cheap capital for homes and land development, which also provides large-scale developers with access to capital needed to keep laws favorable to their ends. How do we address this negative feedback loop?
I'm going to chime in here because nobody else is, although I don't have the answer. This is a really tough question. There are economies of scale in housing development, and what we've seen is more and more large-scale development and fewer small-scale developments. I do think this issue is an important one, particularly not only the housing side, but on the business side. Can we create developments and mixed use products that allow for smaller scale, small businesses and smaller housing developers? I think that's a really critical question, and that frankly I don't think we've cracked just yet.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would just add that when you have systems that are overly regulatory and try and prescribe too much, they tend to favor large developers and large home builders who learn how to take advantage of those systems and game the systems. So when you simplify your regulations and make them focus on outcomes and results rather than just checking boxes on a regulatory list, if you focus on outcomes, Garrett's right, you're still going to have a difficult time adding to small scale developers, but I think you can make a start.
Okay, thanks, John. Next question here is from one of our colleagues in Maryland, Jason Dubois, who's asking, what role do networks of cities such as the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group and the Bloomberg Cities Network have in ensuring the success of smart growth and sustainability?
I can jump on that. I think they have been doing a lot of work on climate plans and resiliency plans, and that's an area that Smart Growth Original 10 Principles did not engage with very substantially, and I think is an increasingly recognized and big opportunity for smart growth advocates to work together on with folks like C40. We have 2 chapters that explored questions of resilience and energy, and both found that these have strong connections with land development patterns and transportation patterns. So thinking carefully about how the future regulations affect land development patterns and where climate considerations, resilience considerations, health considerations, vulnerability, and other metrics could be used in those plan making processes would be helpful and would be a way to engage with folks from, say, C40.
This is Garrett. So Jason, great to hear the question. Nice to hear from you. Actually, we've had a bit of an internal debate about this. I've been advocating for state climate plans and linking those state climate plans to land use plans and processes. There are others among us who are less optimistic about that strategy. And as you know, it's been sort of a mixed bag in Maryland, as certainly you know. But I don't see any way we're going to get our hands around the climate problem if we don't link our climate plans to our land use and our transportation plan. So to me, that's a direction that we ought to move. There are others of my colleagues who are not as optimistic about that strategy moving forward. The unnamed colleague.
That would be me. So I did a study a few years ago looking at the states that had growth management and the states that had climate plans to try to understand the connections and nexus between transportation, growth management, and climate planning, California, Oregon, Washington, and Maryland. And there are a lot of missed opportunities there to really align those things and to really understand that our land use policy is essential to reaching our climate targets, and that our transportation plans are hugely essential as well. But where these plans at the time, about 5 years ago, were still operating very separately. And we were doing climate plans and adopting goals, but not really changing anything as it came to investments and incentives to actually make progress on those goals. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities there, but where I sit in Oregon and watching what has happened in California with SB 375, I'm pretty pessimistic about the approaches that have been taken so far. And I think it actually goes back to something that John mentioned earlier that I think is also a challenge with smart growth. We never created new funding sources. We just reallocated some of our existing funding sources. And someone asked an infrastructure question in the chat earlier, and I think this really goes with a lot of the issues that we're facing. We've never created that sort of resources to be able to invest and to be able to do something different as it relates to development patterns, because we've just been really nibbling at the edges in terms of throwing a couple $1 million here or there to invest in these different strategies. And I think with climate change planning, with housing, with all these other sorts of issues, we need a bigger scale of investment. You're hearing chatter about this at a federal level, but whether we sort of see the Green New Deal approach to investment in infrastructure, or whether it becomes something that's more politically palatable and scaled back, I think will really affect whether we can make progress on these different goals. And so all of that is to say that I think that there are opportunities here, but I think that the current approaches have not proven to go far enough. There is a need to actually set aside funding to change the way that we are doing things, and not just create more plans.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Just looking at the time, we'll be asking everybody to have some closing thoughts in a minute, but just wanted to have a couple more questions and note to the audience, a lot of the comments and questions that we've been receiving today have been comments, so we'll share them with the panel so that they can review them as we prepare the next 3 programs. So possibly some of these things can be addressed as part of the presentations. Next question here is from Ryan Stevenson, who's saying, awesome presentation and series. And I think this is referring to some of the data that Garrett and Arnab initially presented, in the sense that it says, you reported in smart growth in the media and academia. What are the broader how are broader subjects tracking urban design, and geography? Is there another area of focus that is gaining while smart growth is declining?
So I'll take that on briefly. I can't. So when we did this search for terms in the media and in professional publications and events, we started with smart growth and new urban and sustainable development, but we also looked at some keyword searches around the principles of mixed use, sense of place, and transportation land use. It's hard to summarize in a minute or two in a webinar. But I would describe it as being a little bit all over the place, and that there is, unlike the term smart growth, which has a clear, cycle, many of the other terms like mixed use and infill and transportation and land use, bounce around, more up and down. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I can tell you that we are looking at that, and we'll soon be producing a working paper on the results of that analysis.
Great, thanks, Gerrit. I guess our last question here before we wrap with final thoughts is from Patrice Carroll, who says that many young planners are rejecting smart growth and are only interested or mostly interested in social equity. How do you help your students develop a broader historical planning perspective?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. It suggested something similar in my part of the presentation. I've just, over time, really moved some of this to historical analysis of the kind that John Landis presented. And I think the principles are very valid and very current and will endure, but part of the marketing as a package, I think, leaves out too many currently important and relatable things, which needs to be updated, as some of our work here is trying to do. But I think it is important to understand the evolution and how the regulations and other planning processes have gone through, again, the different eras of land use, as John pointed out earlier. So I think it's important to stress that land use, transportation, and those development patterns matter. Understand how the markets work, how the politics of this works, even with that framing of equity. So I think it's still relevant, though perhaps less as a package, and we have to make more and more room in our discussions and courses that accommodate these new principles and new goals and new stressors.
Well, I'll say something that may not be too popular, which is that that's what I specialize in, which is that in academia, our students are right to be very interested in social equity and social justice. But I'm not sure that which is important, I'm not sure that level of interest extends to the broader population as a whole, the broader populace as a whole. Thankfully, our students are leading the charge, but I think we also have to engage the broader population. And I think the difference is that to our students, when we talk about equity, they primarily see justice, social justice, racial justice, which is important. But when you look at the broader population, I think many in the broader population, when you talk about equity, they see that as redistribution, which is if they're doing pretty well, they may not think that's a great idea. So I think we have to reframe the discussion away from just talking about equity as either justice or redistribution, because those then become triggers for different groups to talk about expanding opportunity and talk about how, whether it's smart growth or development, can expand opportunities and improve outcomes for everybody. So rather than talking just about equity, let's talk about inclusiveness and let's talk about opportunity as well.
Great, thanks, John. So with that, I think we're going to wrap and ask each of our panelists to give us some closing thoughts and takeaways today. And I'm actually going to go in the reverse order of our speakers and start with Rebecca, who will actually be joining us next week for part 2 of this. So maybe you want to briefly outline what we'll be talking about next time.
Yeah, so in the next series of webinars, as Arnab mentioned, we have 18 chapters, and it's impossible for us to incorporate every single one of those authors into these short presentations, but we're trying to sort of handpick different thematic areas to talk about. So you'll hear about land conservation, you'll hear about urban design, and you'll hear about transportation next week. So we'll be focusing on the original 10 principles and talk about, what was there and sort of where these authors have seen policy go over time. And the webinar after that, we'll be getting in these issues that a lot of you are raising about equity, gentrification, displacement, and revisiting these topics that were left out of this original 10 principles or weren't as central to them. So I think as we continue throughout this, understanding sort of how far we've come on these different topics, how we're thinking about these issues differently than we were 25 years ago, how cities, states, and the federal level is governing will be interesting to keep track. And I want to just encourage that it's really great to hear from all of you. We're academics that have kind of been in our own heads about this for the last 18 months or so. And so hearing from practitioners, hearing from those of you on the ground about how smart growth is affecting your work, how you're thinking about it differently than you might have in the past is really valuable. So please keep coming and please keep the questions and comments coming, whether it's through the webinar or through email. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, John?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sorry I don't have a very good answer. First of all, read the book because the book is not ideological, it's evidence-based. So if you want to find out things that have worked or not worked and why, the book will help you. And that's a sort of educating yourself as to what works and why is a good first starting point. I'd say, again, the great benefit of having such a diverse country is there are lots of things being tried in lots of places, and sort of reactivating some sort of smart growth network and attaching it to issues of equity and opportunity and inclusiveness, I think is the way to go, because inclusiveness is the idea of including ideas, not just people. And so by focusing ideas, having an inclusive network that focuses on things that work for diverse populations, I think that may be the way to go.
Great, thanks, John. Arnab?
Very quickly, thank you all for attending and for the great questions. As I noted earlier, our 4th session is still TBD. If you have ideas of what you would like us to cover or suggestions for folks you would like to see, let us know. We'll try to make that work to the extent possible. And thanks again for coming today.
Thanks, and we'll close with Garrett.
Great, thanks a lot. So again, I want to repeat the thanks to the Smart Growth Network, to MDP, our good friends up the road, and reiterate, repeat what Rebecca said. The book isn't in print yet, and so one of our objectives in really doing this webinar is to get some ideas and suggestions off the ground. So please do comment, tell us we're nuts, tell us you agree, tell us you disagree, raise questions. It will improve the quality of the book and hopefully improve the quality of planning and help shape the direction of smart growth going forward, which is what we aim to do. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Garrett, and thanks to everybody today. This will conclude our webinar, Smart Growth at 25, looking forward, looking back. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to our panelists for a great presentation, to everyone who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen and answers your questions about audio and other issues during the presentation. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email. When you exit today, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including one this Thursday on the top 5 missing middle housing implementation mistakes and how to avoid them with Dan Parolic. And you can register for that on the web, and we will be sending out shortly the registration link to part 2 of this series, which will be next Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. See you all then, and have a good day.